So moving on from trench warfare, the um, the first part of World War I we're going to talk about is what happened on the Western Front, which is where World War I actually begins. So go ahead and take a minute, prepare a new quad chart, um, and fill in our essential question, which what military strategies were used on the Western Front during World War I, and then we'll get started. Germany was very prepared for the beginning of World War I. France and Russia were really not as mobile, as advanced, or technological as of an army. And I've studied with some historians that would make the comment that the German army from World War I, if you make allowances for technology, was probably the best physical army ever fielded on a modern battlefield. The plan that they had initially to move into France was called the Schlieffen Plan. And the Schlieffen Plan was really developed and based on the need for speed and moving into and quickly dominating France. And they would dominate France by taking Paris. And they believed that if Paris fell, that France itself would capitulate and the war would be over. Now, Schlieffen's peers, kind of disagreed with them. They wanted to attack Russia first. And Schlieffen thought that Russia was too big. I mean, too many armies have died in Russia because the vast expanse of the terrain there is just too large to supply your army logistically. So he won over the Kaiser, and he got the opportunity to execute the Schlieffen Plan. And again, the objective of this was to quickly defeat France so that they could move back by rail to fight Russia on the Eastern Front, thereby not fighting a two-front war. Von Moltke really keeps the entire plan from falling apart by strengthening the left flank of this operation here. So as you see, it looks like a massive left hook coming in to defeat Paris. The entire French defenses are located right here, but this was the weakest part of the German offensive, and von Moltke is the one who's credited for really strengthening that operation. Otherwise, many people don't think that this plan would have gotten off at all. As soon as Germany invades Belgium, Great Britain enters the war, and the British Expeditionary Forces move over into Belgium, which start the initial slowing process of the Schlieffen Plan. And it's set at the Battle of the Marne. And it really stops the German offensive about 43 miles outside of Paris, which is interesting because, the Germans didn't call the Schlieffen Plan. They called it Plan 42 because the plan had to be executed in 42 days. They felt they had 42 days that they could hold off the Russians from mobilizing, that they had enough logistics to supply their army, and that they could actually knock out France in 42 days. Well, on the 43rd day of Plan 42, they were 43 miles short of Paris and ultimately could not continue any longer. So they retreat back to the northeast. They find some high ground, which gives them some tactical superiority, and they dig in, which sets the stage for 4 years of just obliterating trench warfare. And this is a huge shift. It's a change from anything we've ever seen in the past. Previously, and in more ancient warfare, when armies would fight and an army would lose, they'd lick their wounds, they'd collect their wounded, and they'd go back home. And they'd usually pay some concessions. But not in World War I. That's changed. And some of what caused that to change was that evolution in technology that we talked about in the last discussion. So what they did, instead of going home, is they decided to keep the amount of terrain that they had physically, and they dig in, and they hold that ground for about 4 years. So why did the Schlieffen Plan fail? It was a pretty good plan. We'll see it executed again when we get to World War II. A little bit better with more technology. But in this case, in 1915, the Belgian resistance was too strong, and the Germans didn't anticipate that. The British Expeditionary Force mobilized quickly into Belgium and was able to slow the advance of the German army. The Russians mobilized much faster than the Germans anticipated, and they had to turn their attention back to the Eastern Front. And then the French railway system, I think, is something that nobody had really planned upon. There was no unified common rail system in Europe at the time. So different companies built different size of rails, and the French rail system was not compatible with the German rail system. So consequently, they couldn't just continue rolling down the railroad. They had to either build new railroads or they had to take over French railroads and French locomotives to move their logistical supplies. Consequently, they didn't estimate enough logistical supplies to make it all the way in there. Of course, this battle lines, these front lines of trenches, last for hundreds of miles across Europe, really moving all the way up into the northern part of the area up here, which Germany is really trying to cut off supply lines to France and to Great Britain. If they can control those ports up in the north, then the Germans would be in control of logistical supplies, and they'd be able to apply that as a strategy of attrition to try to stop the British and the French, which is what leads to really the stalemate. Very, very little changes on the front lines in the Western Front in World War I. As trench warfare begins, we talked about in the last discussion about just the battle of attrition and trying to outlive and outlast the enemy. A part of this is because the French didn't have a very good plan. Plan 17 was limited in scope, where they put their defensive lines. Schlieffen went around the French defenses for the most part, but the French were not led very well. Their officers were really fighting the last war, and there's instances where the French had massed their brigades in large open valleys. The officers wearing white gloves and silver helmets, all riding on horseback, which just made them prime, opportunity for slaughter against artillery and machine guns. Which this brings us to the race to the sea, which is what I talked about just a second ago. Germany's attempt to seize these naval ports up here caused some pretty intense battles as they moved up toward the English Channel and the North Sea. But again, the objective of that was to try to deny logistical supplies from getting in to Great Britain and France and play into that battle of attrition. Again, French were not prepared at all for World War I. They lacked significant artillery support and technology and how to employ their artillery. They emphasized massive bombardments and barrages rather than any type of strategic employment of artillery to remove or destroy anything that the Germans were moving forward. And then Italy decides to change sides. Remember, Italy was on the side of Germany at the beginning of this, and they had occupied Austria-Hungarian troops that were in the Alps. And the first thing that Italy does is they turn and they start fighting against the Austro-Hungarians and try to eliminate those troops out of the Italian Alps. Very, very difficult problem for them to do. Fighting in the Alps is very challenging, and they lost over 500,000 people while they were trying to do that. You can see in just a couple of pictures why it's so challenging to fight in the Alps. If you just look at the terrain and look at that machine gun placed on high angle, the amount of manpower and effort it takes to move and to move equipment in this terrain is incredible. Also shown by this picture here of moving an artillery piece up a fairly sheer cliff in the Italian Alps. And this device, primitive device right here, is called a gin pole. So you would have to move that 100 feet at a time and then set it down, move the gin pole higher, and you can see the amount of manpower it takes to move one artillery piece into position is significant. If you look at the terrain around here, I just want you to think for a second, what do you think, aside from combat, what do you think one major obstacle the Italians had was in dealing with moving around here? What do you think could happen to cause them mass casualties very quick? If you said avalanches, that's true. Anything really above about 40 degrees is dangerous for avalanche, and this hill behind this gym pole is significantly higher than 40 degrees. But avalanches caused a lot of Italian casualties during this part of World War I. And a few years ago, before I'd retired from the Army, I sent some guys over to do some climbing in Italy with the Italians. And because of global warming, a lot of this is now becoming uncovered. And this is a picture of the remains of an Italian soldier that they came upon during that training event. Obviously reported to the Italian authorities and had some archaeologists come out and remove the remains. 1916 is called the Killing Year, and Germany turns to a different leader, Erich von Falkenhayn, and he looks to try to change the course of the battle. Of course, we've already been it's static trench warfare for a while, and he convinces them that their enemies have more manpower than they have greater resources than they have. Decisive victory with one battle is not going to be achievable. Britain is the most powerful enemy that they've got. They can't directly attack them. Russia is too big, so they can't attack them. But France really kind of caught in the middle, where a lot of this fighting is going on, and not as strong. France is where they should direct their efforts, and he decides to do that by just trying to break the morale through attrition. And the place that he chooses to do this is at the fortress city of Verdun. And Verdun is not truly a fortress on the city. Verdun is a city located in a general area in eastern France. And there are 17 of these old medieval fortresses that are out there. And some of them are very primitive, just earth berms, and some of them are modified and improved to be a formidable fortress in World War I. And Germany's attacking all 17 of them. So Philippe Pétain is the French commander that's chosen to come in and lead the defense. He's a defensive commander known for his defensive abilities. So he sets the defense up in Verdun, and he gets sick and essentially has a pneumonia for the majority of the battle, and he can't even get out of bed. So the battle goes on really unled by the French general that's put in charge. The quote that comes out of this battle is, "Artillery is the butcher and the infantry are the cattle." If you can think of that as a metaphor for the artillery is just slaughtering everything out on the ground, and nearly 2 million casualties come out of this battle. This is the Douaumont Fortress, which is the biggest fortress in the Verdun area before the Battle of Verdun. You can see that it has earthen berms all the way around it, and you can see what looks like concrete walls that have been built up inside, and then the living area inside from where they were. And there's some trench lines that have started out here. So before the end of this battle, there will be trenches all the way around it. This is before the battle, and this is after. And you can see every one of these little marks is an artillery shell explosion or an artillery crater. You can see the walls on this side are almost completely destroyed. The inner areas where people would have been living are almost completely destroyed. And you see the developments of more additional trenches that have formed throughout this area during the battle. And again, like we talked about in the last discussion, life in the trenches is not good. You see men waiting in the trenches, just probably waiting on the next artillery piece, going mad. And then the dead are just stacked up right next to them. German attacks had to be reduced to redeploy people to another battle that's about to start, that the British are forming up for the Battle of the Somme. And it's the entire reason the British are starting that battle is to try to relieve some of this pressure on the French at Verdun. Because if the French would have cracked, perhaps Germany would have been victorious in this war. Battle of the Somme is led by General Douglas Haig. Here's a picture of General Haig. He commands the British Expeditionary Forces, and his objective is to divert a German attention from Verdun and destroy the German forward defenses. And he does this initially with a 8-day preliminary bombardment. And this bombardment is so loud, 24 hours a day for eight continuous days, that it can be heard across the English Channel. Haig is overconfident. He thinks that this artillery bombardment is going to defeat the Germans, and they'll just be able to easily take over the trenches. In fact, there are some instances where British soldiers were told that you're not even going to have to assault or run across no man's land. You can just walk over there and take the trenches because our artillery has already killed all of them. But we know that from the way Germans prepared their trench lines and their defenses, that they went deep underground into those dugouts, and they were safe from those artillery shells. And another error that he made, or that the British Expeditionary Forces made, is that 3 out of every 4 of those shells were anti-personnel, which would have been fine if the men were up on top of the trenches. an anti-personnel shell. It explodes in the air and it has some flechette, kind of like a shotgun round, that comes down and would injure or kill those infantry soldiers from the enemy. But with 3 out of 4 of those exploding high, not being able to penetrate below those trench lines into those rooms, they were really, really ineffective. And the Germans waited until the bombardment was over. They came out, they occupied their machine guns and completely slaughtered the first waves of the British that came across, to a tune of over 60,000 wounded in the very first day. A lot of this is because the Germans held that high ground, and holding tactically superior ground gives them an advantage in any kind of battle. It's much harder to fight uphill as it is to fight or shoot downhill. Haig never sees the battlefield, and he makes this comment later in the war when he's there. He's like, "Oh my God, I can't believe I sent men to fight in this terrain." But he never saw the battlefield, and one of the errors that he makes is just leading from the rear. Finally, he halts the offensive. They've gained about 10 miles. Nothing tactically gained or strategically gained in trying to defeat the Germans in the war. But the Germans did retreat back about 40 miles. So it's looked at as a victory for the British, although nothing significantly is gained or lost on either side. And Haig is praised for this, also condemned because he, like other generals, he doesn't use modern tactics. The Germans were occupying a place of superiority and high ground, and he just walked his men right across and into that gunfire. Causes for failure: they attack in broad daylight. Very easy as a machine gunner or even as a artillery spotter to fire accurately towards troops moving in the daylight. Their artillery shells were not effectively employed. 3 out of 4 were anti-personnel shells, and they carried 60 kilograms of equipment. I mean, imagine that. It's 2.2 pounds per kilogram, well over 120 pounds of weight that each one of these men had to carry through muddy, nasty, barbed wire ridden terrain. Almost impossible to carry that kind of weight and continue to fight. And again, they just walked across into machine gun fire. Germany takes a change after this, after Verdun, after Battle of the Somme, and they dismiss Falkenhayn, and they hire 2 other generals, or they put in charge 2 other generals, which issues into a time of military dictatorships. Both Hindenburg and Ludendorff had cult-like status in Germany. They were previous war heroes, and the population loved them, and it so much to the point that eroded support for the Kaiser, and they could do pretty much whatever they wanted, and they did without anybody really being able to check them. And one of the things that they did, which brings America into the war later, is that Hindenburg authorized the unrestricted attacks on merchant ships coming across from America. And of course, this is one of the catalysts that gets us involved. Not the only catalyst with the sinking of the Lusitania, but it's one of those catalysts that gets America involved in coming into World War I. Really towards the end of the war. But that was Hindenburg's decision, not a national decision, not the Kaiser's decision to do that, because these guys had so much power. Ludendorff really changes the face of battle for Germany and reinvents the modern battlefield. And he does this really through a strategy called defense in depth. If you can remember how the stormtroopers were doing attack in depth, right? They were going attack into enemy lines and then coming back. So Ludendorff's policy is, or his strategy is, we're gonna conduct defense in depth. So if you can imagine 2 trench lines, both within artillery range of their enemy, constantly being bombarded by the enemy, Ludendorff decides we're going to remove that our infantry from the very front lines. And I'm only going to put machine gun positions out there. So instead of having a line of trenches, I've just got some machine gun positions. And behind the machine gun positions, I'll build a couple of strong points with multiple people, maybe a platoon, and they can fight from there. And then way behind those elements, I'm going to put my infantry, my main trench line. So really what he's doing, he's fortifying no man's land. So instead of walking across until you're within machine gun range, as soon as the British would attack, they're in machine gun range. Those machine gun positions and strong points can engage them. So fighting all the way through that, They're constantly taking casualties, having to tend to casualties, having to move people back, and really it contributes to more and more attrition. The other thing that he does is he gives junior officers the ability to make decisions out on the ground. So instead of the generals in the rear telling them who to fight, how to fight, those junior officers out on the ground, out in the strong points, were the ones making the tactical decisions that were giving Germany the advantage in some of these later battles. And he rolls all this up later in a manual called The Conduct of Defensive Battle. And Ludendorff really becomes known for changing the way armies fight and then documenting that so that you can disseminate that information down to the lowest level. And all the lieutenants, all the non-commissioned officers out on the ground have the ability to employ those tactics and make decisions when it counts.